I'll be talking, as he said, about, my name is Gregory Rasner. I'll be talking about third-party threat hunting. Let me push that again and see if that works. Third-party threat hunting, which is my moniker for how I think we should evolve what third-party risk is focused on, which is, I believe, more on cybersecurity and actually diving into it a little bit more aggressively than has traditionally been done. So everybody can hear me? Everything's good? Okay.
Yeah, all working, mate, all working.
Great. So one of the things that folks ask me about is why the focus on cybersecurity. And the reason why we focus, because there's other domains within third-party risk. There's financial risk, reputational risk. All of us on finance here know about the multiple domains that we get with third-party risk. The reason why is as I described here on this first slide to get everybody's attention is all these breaches with these big names that we see here on the screen were actually a result of a third party. So Tesla, Boeing, Equifax, all these were actually a result not of, in this case, the large company that we see here, but a result of a third party and a cyber breach at that third party. So there are countless examples of this, and it gets the most amount of attention reputationally, as well as financial cost to the companies. One of the other reasons why I think it's really important in cybersecurity should be the focus is it doesn't matter anymore if you're in a highly regulated environment like we are in finance. You are now subject to a multitude of local and state, federal, government, international regulations around data privacy. And so it's really every industry worldwide, finance especially, but everybody else can be affected as well. So what is the risk? I'm going to share some data here. Some of this data was taken before the pandemic. So obviously the numbers might be slightly elevated as most of us have learned. But this is the number of third parties an average company shares PI with is 588. That's a large number. So the attack surface is very large. Again, before the pandemic, 59% of the companies have been affected by a third-party breach in the last year. That number is obviously going to change as the dust settles. 60% is a percentage of companies who admit not performing adequate cybersecurity vetting. 33% are the percentage of companies that have none or ad hoc cybersecurity vetting for third parties. And then I think more importantly is I know, Richard, I think you shared a number before of a couple 100%. The latest number from FBI is 800%. The numbers vary. Let's just say there's a huge increase in the cyber attacks. Everybody is somebody else's vendor. So that just would obviously increase the amount of attack surface and the concern. So why and what is cyber third-party risk? It's a cybersecurity focused approach to third party. So again, we talked about there are other domains, and it's not that those domains aren't important. It's just that the cybersecurity focus is sometimes done by the same risk department and not necessarily cybersecurity. Many other organizations only focused on one of the CIA pillars. If you're in cybersecurity, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, maybe two, but almost never all three. The other issue that a lot of organizations deal with, of course, is the skills gap. So cybersecurity professionals are in high demand right now. Finding folks who are expert in this area is difficult and expensive. So a lot of times they'll rely on a checklist to kind of build that gap between expertise and knowledge base and filling out the due diligence. But a checklist is not a conversation. It's not a great way to assess cybersecurity as a whole at a firm, at a vendor. The other reason is CISOs are responsible for an organization's cybersecurity. So they're also responsible if a third party is responsible for the breach of the vendor's data. The board and everybody else is going to look into the CISO to understand what happened. And so understanding that cybersecurity is at the tip of the spear for the third party risk is important here because of that. And then lastly, as we've already said, the number of third and fourth party high risk vectors now after COVID-19 is definitely increased, and we definitely need to step into it a little more aggressively. All right, so the current cyber third-party risk consists mostly of remote assessments. These are where you send a questionnaire to a vendor. And it's the equivalent of asking your kids, is your room clean? All of us have either been kids, obviously, or have kids and understand what that means. Is it generally is you get a different definition of clean than what as a parent you would do. The other one is an on-site assessment. These are a little expensive in terms of resource and travel dollars. Right now, a lot of firms are doing these virtually with things like Zoom or WebEx, but they typically run 2 to 5 business days, and they're performing on cybersecurity and other questions. Again, this is equivalent of going to have the parents go to the room to say, is the room really clean? And you look under the bed, and in fact, it's not cleaner, and all the stuff has been shoved into the closet, is typical for my kids. That's not my definition of clean, and the same thing should go for cybersecurity assessments. When you go there, you see a different thing than what usually the vendor reports, and so that's why on-site assessments are really critical, and then we'll get into how those should be assessed. Again, this is around and on the on-site and even on the remote assessments, checklist versus conversations. Compliance checklists, and this is why a lot of third-party risk sits inside a GRC at most banks, most financial institutions. It's a compliance requirement. And so, supplier management, vendor management, and vendor risk are compliance requirements. And so a lot of times it gets around just a checklist. Let's make sure that we get this done so that the regulators, it will stay off our backs. And that's obviously not sufficient given the number of cyber attacks that are going on now. A conversation is less of a checklist where you're just saying, do you do this? Yes. Do you do this? Yes. Do you do this? No. And as having a domain-based question where it's asking really about the vendor security policies. So an example here would be, hey, vendor A, please show us your access management policy. And then when you look at the access management policy, you look and then see, okay, I see here what your password complexity rules are. Show us how you enforce that in production, right? So you're diving into the policies and looking to see, are there gaps in policies? Are the policies being updated per their own policy, annually, biannually? And then how are they enforcing those? Because a lot of times you'll find that the policies are well written, perhaps, but really not being enforced in production. So the answers that you get off a remote assessment, for example, on a checklist will follow what the policies are, but not necessarily what's actually in production, okay? Third parties are a partner in your success. So that's why the conversation is important, because when you're conversing with folks, you're building up trust, you're building up a relationship. And I really do believe, third parties are not, they're not antagonists here. They're not somebody to find a gotcha game with. They are your partners in success, meaning either producing more productivity or more income for your firm. So up-leveling the security for the vendor up-levels the security for both organizations. And then I think the number one issue here is it's great to find these issues. Not great, but it's great that you find them so you can recognize where the gaps are. But the number one issue should be closing those issues we're finding. So owning those, particularly in the cybersecurity space, because of the complexity around some of those issues and concerns and gaps, is having the cybersecurity folks involved in looking at the remediation that the vendor is doing and ensuring that in fact it did close the gap. Relying on a vendor manager or a salesperson to do that is really unfair on those folks. The level of complexity cannot be addressed by that level of knowledge. Problem with the current approach. Point in time assessments. I talked about them at the beginning of this, and they're extremely important. However, they're not enough. There's a huge amount of time between those point in time assessments, whether it's a remote or an on-site, anywhere from 364 days if you're visiting the vendor on a yearly basis, or more, depending if your risk is less with the vendor. A lot can happen in between those questionnaires and audits, right, or assessments. So how do you do that? One of the ways to do that is to change the mindset and understand that third-party risk folks really should view themselves as third-party threat hunters, right? And that's just not a point in time compliance checkbox activity. It's around continuous monitoring. Now, some firms have continuous monitoring in place. Most don't. And those that do, I think we've learned can up-level that and actually make it a little bit more pointed and aggressive to get better results from risk reduction. Let's define it. Continuous monitoring for third-party risk uses a variety of tools, which I'll go into, to provide near real-time data to inform on risk and take action to reduce it when required. So there's how to accomplish it. There are 3 different elements that I've defined that help understand how to accomplish it. One is the data sources. I'll go into each of these: due diligence and then cyber intelligence. Let's first talk about data sources. So first is vendor reputation tools. There's a number of those out there. If you do a search on Google, you can come up with those. A lot of these focus on eye candy. So whatever the tool of choice is you use on these vendor reputation tools, a lot of times it can be a score or a letter grade or red, yellow, green. While those are important, it's not a great conversation with a vendor to say, hey, your score doesn't look great. Focus on a specific criteria that are important for your risk, and things like spam propagation, botnet infections, open ports, that kind of thing. And then focus on threshold and alerts. You don't need to necessarily act on every single alert. Figure out what's important for you to trigger off of to get the point to where you need to engage with a vendor. APIs are a decent way to get data. It's a little more challenging because here's what we propose and here's what we do is you use the APIs are available from Azure, AWS. I think Google's got them as well, that will help you monitor the health and well-being, in this case, security well-being of your cloud vendor. Where you need to negotiate this is obviously with a third party using the cloud service provider is getting their permission and buy-in on doing this. The idea there is that you can get alerted if, let's say, on the AWS instance where your stuff is lying with the third party, if somebody turns on multi-factor authentication for the root access, that you would get alerted as well as the vendor, so you could take action. That's another data source. And then logs. For key vendors, this isn't clearly going to be for every vendor, but if you have a key vendor that's systemically critical, lots of revenue, lots of PII going back and forth, actually consuming the logs and then using that to do a more direct sort of hands-on monitoring is certainly viable. Again, you'd want to do a risk-based approach. This wouldn't be for every vendor, and you need to work out how and who's responsible for finding things. But that's another data source. There are others that I've not mentioned, but these are 3 big ones. On the due diligence side, you can use internal due diligence. Remote and on-site assessment findings, systems of record to find out what's the data that's being transferred, the amount of data, those kind of things. Any high risk acceptances that have been done against the vendor, those would be open. The risk has been accepted, but it's still an open risk. So putting those as due diligence data. Web searches, just a good old-fashioned web search to find more intelligence. Cyber intelligence, and I apologize for going a little bit fast. I'm gonna try and slow down a little bit, but I want to make sure I'm respectful of other people's time. Cyber intelligence forums. So whether it's vendor-based or your own research, meaning there are vendors out there that will provide you obviously with that cyber intelligence, and it used to build data around the threat and better intelligence. And again, I'll get into this on a specific example about how this works. And the last 2 here are around alignment with cyber ops and your cyber incident management team. There's a lot more incidents, which means there's a lot more notifications about your potential third-party breaches. So alignment with the CIMT and your cyber ops, I think, really helps for the sharing of information quickly to jump on top of potential incidents with third parties or fourth parties and then being able to address them quickly. We're going to take all these 3 and put them into a continuous monitoring, but let's walk through how that does. So let's just do a sample here. So you get a data source, you get an alert from, let's say, your vendor reputation tool that there's been a botnet infection on ABC data processor. You go look in your due diligence. There's an open issue that the users have admin rights on their laptops, and there's an open risk acceptance of insufficient DLP. Great. So now you're going down the list. You go look at some cyber intel, you find out that the botnet is a known browser add-on, meaning that the admin rights for the users could actually add it, and that the botnet can actually perform key logging. So along with the DLP now you're able to add up to a conversation to engage with the vendor, say, dear data processor. We see evidence of a key logging botnet, and along with the other issues, we need to have a discussion. That's a much more sort of focused, intelligent discussion with a vendor about a specific threat and the vendor can then address it, as opposed to saying, hey, your score doesn't look great. You can have a specific discussion about what things you want to focus on with that vendor. All right, there's also some enhanced continuous monitoring. This is around getting around some reliance on your vendor reputation tool and almost doing a vulnerability management for your high-risk vendors. Identify your high-risk vendors. This needs to be a risk priority-based approach, because obviously if you have 500 plus vendors, you don't want to be doing this for all 500 vendors. You want to look at your systemically critical high-risk vendors. High risk would be vendors with lots of data, millions of records perhaps. And start pulling them on this data. Now, sometimes this data is captured on intake, sometimes it's not, depends again on the firm, but you should be capturing this on intake. But if it's not, or even if it is, sometimes the data gets stale. And also when you're focusing on these high risk vendors, you want really detailed information. So this is perhaps some of the areas you could ask. What are their third parties? What are your fourth parties? Get at details around the connectivity. So if they have like say a leased line between you and this vendor, a lot of times the vendor supplies the hardware, and that hardware needs to get updated with software updates as well. So be cognizant of that and be focused on and where they are with that. And then where's your data? Is it in a CSP? Which CSP is it, and which region is it in? This gets you then to be able to connect triggers. So let's say on the connectivity details, it's a certain type of Cisco router. Connecting yourself in with feeds from Cisco or some other data entry point that says, hey, there's a really important CV, a significant CV, or a 0-day vulnerability on this type of hardware, Cisco hardware, and you match that up then with the hardware that's running in your data center that's connected to the vendor. That's a very important conversation for you now to have, that's preemptive, to go to the vendor and say, we've been alerted of this issue. What are you doing to fix it? Okay. And then I guess that's connecting the dots. So connect the dots with the data you got from the vendor with triggers, whether it's done manually or automatically is kind of up to your maturity level. Just a quick blurb about what this team looks like. So these need to be folks who are a little more seasoned so that they can smell when things are not right and be eager about threat hunting and cyber ops. They usually come from that team. And obviously cloud experience, because a lot of this data lies in the cloud. Fourth parties, I want to touch on that real quickly with a little bit of time left. That's obviously is your vendors, third parties. The reason it's important here is that the Ticketmaster breach that happened a few years ago was actually a result of Embedda. Embedda was their third party. But if you were a theater venue operator, you had Ticketmaster operating your ticket sales. You didn't do that yourself. So there's where the fourth party actually was a breach for the theater venue operator. Many companies never ask this. And so you really need to be understanding what the services are provided for the firm and who they use to do that. Ask them what level of supplier due diligence they do. That's important for you to understand. If they're doing their due diligence, due care, then you can take a little bit of comfort in that. Ask on intake and update periodically. Vendors change and you need to change with it. And the contracts should require those updates. And then look at your concentration risk. It can be a number of concentration risks. The one that I like to cite quite honestly is that if you have a lot of third parties who use, let's say AWS as their fourth party, their third party for where your data rides, and it's all you look and see almost everything you have is in US East, you need to figure out how to address that concentration risk. Zero trust for third parties, not often brought up, but it is possible. Never trust, always verify is zero trust model. And this can be done with segmentation for third parties, meaning setting up zones or enclaves that meet the flavor of what those vendors would typically do. Good example would be sales partner versus offshore. You may set up a zone or enclave that is set for sales partner and has a looser set of configuration or restrictions than the offshore. And so that way, as you bring on those new vendors or a sales partner or an offshore, you can drop them into those enclaves and knowing that you don't have to set up any different security. They're already set for it. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, just to let you know that there are ways to do third-party software due diligence. One is asking, do they have a secure software development lifecycle and do they use it? on the on-prem software that you get from a vendor, does the vendor test, will they be willing to share with you the results or process? Do a search on application security testing. There's a number of software that can do this, from a poor man's option to some more expensive options. Cloud software, there is possible to test cloud software, but ensure that you have a test or sandbox area to do that testing. Open source. Heartbleed is a great example of where open source due diligence needs to be stepped up, and ensure vendors are managing their open source software. And then make sure your legal language protects you on these issues. Lastly, reactive versus predictive. You're getting all this data, and a lot of firms don't use this data in a way that helps them go from waiting for a phone call, waiting for on-time assessments, or waiting for a phone call that there's been a breach at a third party, to looking at the data, combining it, and starting to use it more like a SIEM. Whether you use a BI tool or an analytics engine, there's a number of ways you can tackle this. It can be simple, from a stoplight, that as all this data starts to add up with risk for a certain vendor, that it goes from green, yellow to red. And this gets you in front of potential issues as opposed to waiting for those phone calls. And lastly, we'll just kind of wrap it up. Move from compliance to, my alarm going off that I hit my 20-minute mark. Move from compliance to conversations. Expand your continuous monitoring. If you don't have one, get into and expand it. Don't stop at your third parties. Look at fourth parties. Those are equally important to your your third party risk. Zero trust is possible and actually is recommended. And use that data to make risk-based decisions. I think that's certainly something that will get you further along in being more predictive as opposed to reactive. Lastly, just some information on me real quickly. If you have questions and follow-up, you can reach me at greg@thirdpartythreathunting.com, and my LinkedIn profile. Again, happy to answer questions and engage in conversations with my peers and colleagues at other financial institutions. Thanks. Hope that wasn't too quick.